Hey, hey everyone, and hey Lee. And I think I just want to say thank you to everybody that's here, and I'm gonna uh, start the conversation off with Lee and just kind of see where it goes, and then we'll open it up to questions. I just wanted to start by saying Lee is one of my best friends and one of my absolute favorite writers, and I went back before this, knowing we were going to have this talk to find the first email that we ever shared, Lee. And we had met for coffee, and the email was talking about, I guess we both bonded over Carson McCullers and how much we loved her work. And it was I had sent you a link to an Etsy shop to buy a doll, this Carson McCullers doll that was really spooky and creepy that I wanted. And I don't know that I would have sent that to many people but you, and you immediately were like, you have to buy that. And that's when I knew we would be friends.
I remember that doll. It was really horrifying. Yeah, it continues to haunt me.
It's still on my wish list, but no one will buy it for me. But I think I wanted to start off just asking you a little bit about the book itself, a book that, I love so much. It's just kind of a brilliant book in the way that it utilizes humor and the way that it utilizes that humor to talk about really deep, really big subjects. But at the heart of it, there's just these amazing characters, and Ruby and Martin, to my mind, are two of the kind of most characters that I go back to again and again. I can't stop thinking about them and the way that they interact with each other and the world around them. But what I wanted to start with is just to ask you kind of where this book came from. Like, what was the thing that generated the idea for the novel? Like, when did you know it would be a novel? How did you start?
Yeah, how did I start? Well, before I go into that sort of mini story, I just want to say thank you again, Kevin, for hosting this and for, your friendship. And thank you, Sabir, and the Strand bookstore too. And everyone who's here, I'm just so excited to be here in this way, talking about haunted dolls. I'm grateful to Carson McCullers too. So I guess the novel, the idea for the novel started probably around the time I moved to Nashville, and it was my first time living out of New York State. And I found myself just kind of homesick in this way, especially for New York City, even though I was really grateful to have this space to write. And there were these possums in my room. This seems like a strange origin story, but I was being woken up in the middle of the night by these possums in my roof, and I started thinking a little bit about how I grew up, which doesn't have possums at all involved in it. But my dad is a building superintendent, and I used to be, when I was a kid, I would wake up from the sound of tenants like calling with different questions, or sometimes like non-possum pest problems, or a whole range of things. And something about that paralleling with the possums, I was like, I kind of want to write about that building and how that space felt so interconnected in this way to me. But I didn't really want it to be a novel, and I was taking a novella workshop at the time. And so I was like, okay, this is a novella, and I'll get it out of my system. So it started in a much smaller form, and I put it aside for a couple of years, and it just kind of kept growing in my head, becoming more and more about class and about power dynamics in the city. And I realized that it was expanding all the time. So I finally kind of admitted that it was a novel. And from there, I felt a lot more freedom to kind of follow the different wormholes of this building space and of the different tenants there, and in the father-daughter relationship, that this sort of connection, but also sense of sometimes tension because of that really small space that these characters all have to inhabit and live together in.
Yeah, I mean, that's what really drew me to the book initially was what I love so much is I write a lot. Like I like a specific space where I never leave it. Like in my books, I try to never let my characters leave that space, but it's usually like a pretty solitary home. And so one of the things that I loved about this novel is that you have this kind of singular space, but there are so many different people in it. And so the things that come out of that are a lot different. And kind of going to that, thinking about the space, like you have this huge, this apartment building. I wanted to think about time too, because it's the thing I love so much about the book is how compressed the timeline is. And I went back and was reading a lot of the short stories of yours from Subcortical, and the ones that I really love, like What the Blob Said to Me or Subcortical, is you have characters telling the story from a huge temporal distance, right? They're looking back on something in their past. And what's so brilliant about them is the way they're trying to kind of reckon with something that they've done in the past, but not necessarily trying to absolve themselves or explain themselves. And I love how that time works. And so what was so cool to me in this novel, though, is you have this really compressed timeline. What made you think of it being this kind of singular event that you were going to write about?
So I think that, like, as you mentioned in like my stories, I really love that kind of rush of having this compressed story space and then having time like explode out in it. For me, that is like, it's really fun when I read it, and it's like, it keeps me engaged with my characters when I'm writing it. And I think part of the compressed time period with the novel, when I was writing it, I was also writing a lot of stories too alongside it. And I had this intense fear that it would just be these characters thinking, and that like nothing would occur. And I think something about realizing it was a novel too, I was a little bit like, well, you could just throw anything, right? It was, I mean, you can't actually do that, but I was just like, oh, this could just like go and go and go. And it was actually kind of freezing me up a little bit in terms of the writing. And when I sort of decided to compress the action in a day, I don't know, for me, like having those kinds of limits actually frees me up creatively a lot. And it feels both more like a game and also a challenge, and it just activates a different part of my mind. So when I was like, okay, this is a day, all of a sudden things sort of started falling into place more. My characters started acting with more urgency. And yeah, it just really helped me. But in the same way, I think with short stories, like I remember so many times I've sat down and I've been like, this short story is going to be a single scene, the way that like, I feel like short stories can do that so wonderfully, but I get antsy and I start wanting to expand the form. So I think almost the opposite thing happened when I was working on this novel. I wanted to compress it and see what the characters would do within that limited amount of time.
I mean, I think we've talked about this a lot. I think both of us like constraint, like that once we know kind of what the constraint is, then we can kind of get to work, right? And so kind of piggybacking off of that, like this idea of like it takes place like in a really short amount of time. But what I think you do is such a lovely way is that even though it's this compressed amount of time, the relationships between these characters have been kind of honed over years and years and years, and they're all holding on to these kind of complications because of the nature of those relationships. And to me, that's what's really wonderful, is that you can see the relationships between these characters so clearly, even though it's happening in just a small amount of time. And again, when I, having read the book a couple times, what I'm so interested in is what I love are books where books that really kind of look at the threads that connect us to other people, right? And I think about that a lot, like the threads, the lines that you throw up to connect you to other people, right? And one of the things that's so cool about this book, though, that kind of complicates that, is that a lot of times when you're writing about, in this novel, the threads that connect, let's say Martin and Ruby, to other people, they're not necessarily willing threads, right? They're threads that are being enforced upon them. They're being made to be connected to so many people, especially Martin. And I'd like to kind of get your thoughts on that, but also, and not to kind of put you on the spot, but I wondered if there's a moment with Martin. I wondered if you might read from it. I'd love to hear something from the book, and that seems like a pretty cool place to kind of to hear.
Yeah, I would be so happy to read it. That's a nice segue, actually, yeah, I think, so I'm just gonna read maybe just for like a couple of minutes, I think, so there's, when you mentioned interconnection, that makes me think of I feel like you're probably thinking too of that scene in the first chapter. So I'm just gonna read like 2 pages, but I will say, like, in those 2 pages, it's really one very long sentence. So I'm gonna be kind of, barreling through these clauses, so bear with me. So this is actually, I guess, from the beginning of the novel, so I don't have to give you too much scene setting, but I will say that Ruby, Martin's daughter, has woken up very early in the morning, full of anxiety, something that I can really relate to in these pandemic days. And she can't go back to sleep. And so Martin kind of steps in and tries to be fatherly and model for her mindfulness and meditation, which is this sort of thing he started doing a lot more to help deal with the irritation that the tenants often give him all these demands from all these people. So he sort of sees mindfulness and being very present as a way to manage that sense of, let me just say, rage. And so he's trying to model that to Ruby here. And they're both sitting in their living room trying to meditate. Martin's back had gone stiff. His knees creaked. And yet the older he got, the more nimbly his brain made wild leaps through time and space. He was supposed to be here, present, meditating next to his daughter, not thinking about Lily's death or Kenneth's apartments or the pigeons in the courtyard. He breathed in, he breathed out. But then the heat pipe in the living room thumped, and he remembered how the woman in 4B had recently complained about the thumping sound coming from 5B, which was caused by the private tango lessons the woman in 5B was taking with the woman in 2C, who had recently divorced the man who had once lived in 7D, and who had lost his job in advertising just around the time Ruby graduated, and was now in the process of selling his apartment to an heiress whose financial consultant lived in 6C and had complained recently about a leak caused by the attendant to the sick lady in 7C, who poured grease down the kitchen sink, didn't know any better, and who rode the subway from the Bronx every morning with the nanny in 3A, whose young charges tried to poison with cayenne-infused chocolate the pair of yipping Yorkies in 3D, an act of pure malice that didn't much bother anybody, but especially not the attorney in 7A, who had seen the dogs pissing directly onto the red and white impatiens she had asked to be planted in the tree pit outside the building, which were popular flowers with some in the building, yes, but others, like the real estate guy from Lyon in 6B and the financial consultant from Moscow in 8C, felt impatiens were tacky and populist and had tried to advocate for something more elegant. Begonias, perhaps, and also wanted the green awning to be replaced with a burgundy one, but 9D had argued against both begonias and the burgundy color, mostly because he believed 8C was responsible for bringing in the new team of Russian elevator mechanics, who had, in the past, worked on missiles in what 7C was pretty sure these mechanics still called the motherland, and who 7C was also pretty sure were spies of some sort, a suspicion she had confided exclusively, she thought, to 3A. But 3A blabbered about it to the board members, and her blabbering had backfired, so that now 7C was considered a paranoid woman, a possible isolationist bigot, and a loose cannon, which was probably true since after the attacks on September 11th, 7C had spent weeks in Westchester calling Martin about an oncoming toxic cloud headed for Manhattan and asking if he could double check that the windows were all the way closed in the apartment, which was actually the same request made by 7B, who recently had maybe got bed bugs, they blamed the house cleaner, leading 4B, once the news got out, to panic and do laundry for 6 hours straight, which really pissed off 1D because they had kids and the kids had soccer practice, and 4B, whose child merely finger painted and did no competitive sports at all, was using all the machines, which 4B said was a necessary thing because didn't 1D hear about the bedbugs in 7B? And 1D said the bedbugs were just a rumor. The bedbug dog from Queens had come in and sensed nothing. But still, the paranoia reached such a pitch that many of 7B's belongings eventually wound up in the basement, and Martin and Raphael, the porter, had to drag armoires and mattresses and books and clothes out into the courtyard and into the alley and up the stairs for the garbage people to take away to waste transfer centers, to barges, to landfills, to landfills, to landfills. Martin's heart, that dumb, flawed blood hauler, made sounds like a garbage truck in his chest. He had fucked up mindfulness again.
I love that so much.
A long sentence. But yeah, I think to your question about interconnection and this kind of unwilling interconnection, that was something that I was really interested in trying to write about in this book, because I just felt like there were all these kind of invisible relationships in this building, or at least relationships that people kind of pretended were invisible and that they didn't notice. But in Martin's mind, of course, part of his job is just connecting all of these people up, and he's got this kind of map that he holds in his brain. And it's like a map full of irritation and aggravation, but there's also, I think, something kind of beautiful in the way that all that irritation, all of these irritated people, they kind of interconnect into this one story that he's just carrying around in his brain at all times.
And one of the things that I, just hearing you read it so wonderfully is just how funny the book is. Like, it's just, and I looked back at the blurbs for the novel, and I think pretty much every single blurb talks about your wit, your humor. And yet what's so cool about that to me is that the book itself is really interrogating these pretty heavy subjects, class and gender, and you're doing such a wonderful job kind of highlighting those elements, but there's this sharp humor that kind of moves through the novel. And so one of the things I wanted to know is, like, how does humor function for you? Like, is it your way into the material, or is it something that you add, after the fact to kind of figure out how to deal with it? It's just, looking back at even your stories, just like the humor is so sharp and wonderful, and it's present so clearly in this novel too.
Well, thank you. I feel like I should say something very funny in response, or very witty. I definitely think that the humor comes first, but I don't think about it as like, this will be humor on the page. In fact, I often, after I've written something like that ends up reading funny, I'm like, oh no, this will seem very unserious, right? Or like maybe the things that these characters are grappling with in terms of class will be seen as this like it's being taken lightly. But for me, humor is just the most direct way to get at the darkness of things. It's really the only way that I feel like I can do it. I think like sometimes when I don't use that, I think things can feel, or I can be paranoid about them feeling like melodramatic in some way, or kind of like the energy collapsing in on itself. But something about coming at a scene sideways helps me. So the humor, I think, helps me look more directly at what's going on. But I think more than that, for my characters, it's just such a big coping mechanism. It's how they see the world, and it's how they maintain their sense of humanity in a lot of ways, Like if you can joke about something, you're not the butt of the joke. And so I think there's a bit of a sense of power too that comes from being able to humorously see a situation. Yeah, but for me, it's just such a way of getting at the darkness of things. And I don't think I could ever like separate it out.
Yeah, but what's so, I think, skillful in your work is like, there is that humor, but then like moments like with Andy in this book where the darkness really comes in, it doesn't feel like a complete shift. That humor kind of leads you into that darkness in a really nice way. And I've always kind of liked that about your work.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I think that that darkness is just lurking on the other side of a joke at all times. And that's really fun for me to kind of explore how close those two can get.
And I know we need to leave time for questions, you know, and I want to make sure that, and maybe I'll ask just one more question, which is just maybe like a kind of basic question, which is thinking of Caroline and Martin and Ruby and Deborah and Andy, like there's all these really incredible characters. Was there a character that you found like more difficult to write, or that you know, like what was the character that you really felt like you had to kind of focus on to get it the way that you wanted it?
Well, it's interesting because when like my earliest draft of this, the novella, it had one point of view character, which was Ruby. And then there was like another draft where I had a bunch of different characters in the building, sort of like a baton passive point of view. That didn't really work. And when I figured out Martin as a point of view character, that his perspective was really necessary, the book really came together for me. So that's just to say that Ruby has been with the book the longest. It's always sort of been there, but she's definitely been the most difficult character to, or maybe not the most difficult character to write, but the one that I feel like I've had to pay attention to in a certain way. And I think part of that is because we have like these biographical overlaps, like my dad's a super and I'm his daughter, her dad's a super and she's his daughter. And I was always just like really concerned with making sure she was her own person and that she was like becoming a fully fledged self. So I just felt like it was a little bit like just keeping an eye on her at all times and being like, at what point am I projecting on this character? At what point is she just being herself? And so that was a question I felt I had to bring to her a little bit more. And I think it's like a funny thing with other characters who sometimes resemble you less. There's like more of you wind up in them because it feels freer to have that happen. And yet she was a character where I had to really like differentiate in all of these ways to make sure she was kind of doing what she needed to do for herself and for the book.
Oh, I love that. I don't want to give a lot away about the book, you know, like, because I think so much because it's such a compressed narrative, those surprises really, really come up on you. But there is one element of the novel that I don't want to talk too much about, but there is this kind of almost magical, slightly out there element, you know, Lily. And so I wondered, what I love about it is how grounded the novel is. And there's this one kind of element that feels magical or kind of off kilter. And I've noticed that in your short stories a lot too. And like, what is that for you? Like, how do you utilize like not magical realism, but absurdity or weirdness or strangeness in your work?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit similar to the humor thing where it just sort of shows up. And no matter how much I try to edit it back, it just kind of keeps popping up in this way. I know that sometimes, like in drafts of things, if a story isn't activating in some way, if I can lean into a weird element, it really helps me. I think, again, it's just this matter of like looking over here, and that allows me to be more creative or imaginative about the rest of what's going on. So, and sometimes the really weird element kind of gets edited out. So what you're talking about, Lily, she's like this ghost. She's a former tenant who died, and her voice kind of shows up in Martin's mind throughout the novel. And as I was writing that, part of me was like, okay, this you will edit out. You know, or I was like, this is just like a thing that I need to do to figure out some other elements of Martin and the novel. And it can, like, the ghost can always ghost away, right? Like she can always vanish. So yeah, I think a lot of the absurdity, again, it's almost like with the constraints too, it's a little bit of a way of playing a game with yourself, and just allowing yourself to be weird on the page, giving yourself permission to like give up pretensions on the page, and just like leaning into your imagination in that way. I just find it's really helpful for me in terms of just being more direct and real, conversely, with the characters.
And that's what I love so much, like in the same way that your humor works, is that you're really great about creating characters who can handle absurdity or that weirdness, right? And part of what's the fun is watching them kind of contextualize or deal with that strangeness, and that's where the humor, I think, comes out of it too.
And the real world is so absurd. I mean, like I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Like that, like some of my attempts were of like I'll be writing something, I'll be like, this is very weird, but then reality is always just so much stranger.
Well, when you write like that section you read of Martin, so much of it begins to feel absurd, right? It starts to build and build and build, and it's really just a recounting of everything he has to keep track of. And again, I maybe, and this is a weird question, was just, I know one of the things is the way that the world has changed in the lead up to, knowing that your book was going to be published and now it coming out in this time period during a pandemic. And I wondered if there's any elements of the book when you look back at the novel that feel connected to the time period that we're living in, even though obviously it wasn't written during this time. But do you see elements of that in the text?
Yeah, I mean, I think that something that I've been thinking about a lot is this sort of narrative of like, now because of the pandemic, we see how much essential workers matter and how much they keep things running. And just the weirdness of like that we, right? Like now we see, but like who's the we here? And I think, yeah, I just think that's like a very specific point of view. And when I was working on this and just thinking about it, I didn't think of like Martin as this essential worker in the way that we phrase it now, but I was thinking about the way that so many people who keep things running and functioning and have to behave at these very intelligent ways at all times, how that narrative is so often just ignored, or just like other stories like take place and like these characters are in the background more. And so, yeah, I don't know if that like makes it relevant in that way, but it's certainly something that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of like who's like thinking about his story and this time period. And then also, I guess too, we're also there's just like a lot about isolation and then the ways that we're actually interconnected in all these crazy ways. And it's something that I certainly felt growing up, I really saw, just how like there'd be all these building residents in their different apartments not interacting, but like would hear all their different demands or questions or whatever, and they would connect in these different ways. So yeah, I think that feeling of being both isolated and yet hyper aware of like all of these connections is something that's in the book too.
Yeah, and also like kind of the expectations of the tenants and how much they expect Martin to kind of maintain order, amidst chaos. And there is a plot point in the book where someone is trying to get into the building, right? And when I looked at the novel again, under the circumstances that we're living, this idea of like trying to control who gets in or gets out of this building, who can come in and who can stay, felt really relevant and interesting to me. And, I don't know if there's anything else that you want to talk about before we get to the Q&A. One thing is, you mentioned that you wrote most of this when you were in Nashville, like the first time away from New York, and now you're back in New York after being in Japan. I wondered what it feels like to be back in the city, having written about it.
I definitely don't think I could have or would have written this novel if I had been in New York. I think that I really needed that space. Like when you're in a place it's just all around you and it's changing all the time. And the idea of ever like getting a grasp or a handle of it is so clearly fictional. But when at least for me, like when I'm away from a place, it kind of turns a little bit into something I can hold on to. You know, I'm like the New York in this book in so many ways is like the New York of my memory, right? Like how I was remembering it from afar.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important for me in writing this book, right? That I felt far enough away that I could put the city into this book and know that I was drawing in some way from memory, which in itself is a little bit fictional. So it just gave me more permission and freedom to write about the city at length. But yeah, being back here is definitely, like I just came back in January, and I remember when I first got back, I was like, oh, I will be haunted by the city of my youth. Or not like haunted, but I was like, oh, I'm gonna have all these memories of like growing up here. I'll just be walking down a street and I'll remember things. But like then everything has changed so much that that's not happening at all. And I wish that it wasn't changing because there's a pandemic. But I do kind of think it's just so interesting how I thought my experience would be one thing. And then of course, you know, nothing stays still. Everything just keeps changing. And so, yeah, my assumption that I would like access these little portals that would be frozen in time is very, very clearly not true.
Well, we have some questions from people that are viewing, and so I think you'll notice like an uptick in the quality of the question now, and it's from other people.
Those are such good questions. Those are so good.
One of someone has written, and I really am interested in this, is someone has asked, can you speak a little bit about Caroline, the character? As the reader, are we meant to see her as inherently evil, or is it her privilege and wealth that make her kind of unaware of how kind of clueless or harsh she's coming across? This person is thinking specifically about getting Ruby a job interview and the complications of that. It seems like every nice thing that she does actually seems kind of tone deaf. So how does that character work for you?
Yeah, I definitely think tone deaf is a good descriptor. And I don't think that Caroline is evil at all. And I think that's what makes it more, in some ways, difficult for Ruby, is that these actions aren't taking place out of malice. And so on top of sort of like dealing with those reactions, she has to manage Caroline's feelings and the fact that she's often acting from what she thinks is a good place. And so I think that's one of the real challenges in their relationship and in a lot of power relationships. It's not that somebody is behaving in some obviously evil way where they want somebody to suffer. Often they're acting out of what they think of as some kind of sense of nobility or doing good. I think Ruby does this too. She also acts in ways where she thinks she's doing good, but it's really tone deaf. And it has maybe more to do with her sense of wanting to be good than actually paying attention to that ecosystem of what people maybe need around her. So I think they both struggle with that in different ways, but with Caroline, it's exaggerated in some ways, in part because Ruby's the one that's receiving some of these on the other end of some of these actions.
Yeah, there's a weird moment. I think she said, Caroline says, you know, you're my oldest friend to Ruby, right? So there is, no matter what, some idea that they are friends, you know, or that's how they think of themselves. Another question was, in terms of, you talked about it starting as a novella and then developing it with these possibilities of different character voices. So how did you handle the feedback on the manuscript? Like that kind of tricky process of how those comments led you towards what you wanted the book to be?
That's a good question. I'm trying to, feels like a different time. I think that like the comments on the novella, I remember a lot of the nice things people say and just edit out the critique. I think that one thing that sort of having workshopped this like really early version of it helped me do was sort of clarify the vision of the book a little bit, and that it was going to be about these power relationships in class in this really direct way. And I think like showing some version of it to a group of people in that way was actually helpful. Sometimes I don't think that's always the case, but I think in that scenario, it just helped me clarify sort of what I was trying to, or what I was interested in tackling or thinking about with the book.
Is someone else has asked, like, they were interested in the idea that it had originally started as a novella. Is there any like big piece that through all these iterations still remains from that novella, like unchanged? Or
the rhino head, no, I mean I don't want to say too much about it, but that has somehow carried through all of these versions and has stayed strong. And there was also always a party element too. I think that's actually a little bit of a DNA from the novella. I felt like with a shorter form, you could have this event that's occurring and it's like leading up to that. And the party definitely just ended up sticking around. Oh, and the 24-hour period, like the idea of it happening in a day also stuck around. I don't know that I would have tried a novel in a day, like just on my own. Like if I was sitting down, I wouldn't be like, oh, I want this to take place in a day and it's going to be a novel. I think I would have been like, why are you doing that to yourself? But with the novella, it felt like this fun thing that I could do. And so all those elements kind of ended up carrying through to the novel.
Was it always called The Party Upstairs?
No, but it always had party in the title, I think. Okay. Yeah.
I was going to save this for the end because it feels like a good closing question, but I just want to make sure we get to it. And so someone has asked, what are you working on? Like what's coming next? What's the project, that you're focusing on?
Surviving. No, I think right now I'm working on this novel that I was researching at the end of last year in Japan. It has a lot of this theme park called Anne of Canadian Land in it. It's like this Anne of Green Gables theme park. I don't know, that might all disappear from the final version, so I'm hesitant to say it. It's just like, it's like the one element that I feel like is definitely going to be in it. And I'm working on some stories again too, which has been really fun.
I love hearing you talk about that. I hope that theme park element stays in the novel.
Me too.
It's got to. Another question, and this was interesting to me, and I might not be getting it correct, but someone was saying that they loved the idea of like how compartmentalized the novel is, like the apartment building is, and that we've talked about like these characters, all these individual characters, but they were talking about the kind of personification of the spaces themselves. Like, how did you enjoy using kind of personification of the building further in the book? Like, you consider the rooms as characters.
Mm-hmm. So you mean sort of like how people are referred to as 2D or 4D?
Yeah, I said rooms are characters, but there's something profound about considering them as numbers that I like.
Yeah. Well, to be honest, I kind of like, I remember just talking about tenants in the building in that way, where I didn't always know their names, but I'd be like, oh, that's 5D, right? Like that was sort of how I would remember them somehow. And I do think it's funny, right? Because people move in and out of a building or out of an apartment building, but like the apartment stays. So you could have like an apartment that has lots of different people in it, but in a weird way, you've like grown up with the space for longer than the inhabitants. So that's like this presence in this way. So yeah, I think I was thinking about that. And also just thinking about it from Martin and Ruby's perspective, that this is sort of how they keep track of this space, right? And how they sort of manage all these different relationships that are there.
I love that. Someone has asked, what was the hardest part about finishing the book? And is it weird talking about the book now so long after you finished it?
The hardest part about finishing it, I feel like I feel like I had the shape for it for a long time, and the hardest part about finishing it was just kind of making sure that the shape wasn't getting in the way of like what needed to happen in the novel. I don't, maybe that sounds a little abstract, but just like I kind of had, because it had that root in the novella in some ways, and it was this this like object, expanding it in certain ways changed, like there was like a ripple effect in all of the rest of it. So the hardest part was just like making sure that as it grew and grew, the different pieces were still speaking to each other in some way.
I mean, that's one of the things I admire about you so much as a writer, that is a limitation of mine, is just like, I try to write one draft and I'm like, I hope I get it right. I don't want to go back into it. I'm terrified of messing it up. And yet one of the things I love when we would talk about the drafts that you went through is how like cognizant you are of like those ripples, right? And like how unafraid you were of going back into it to get it the way that you wanted it. And I always was just kind of amazed at how good you were at that.
Or maybe you just have less ripples in your thing, that you get the ripples right for the first time.
I just try to make it as flat as possible. So there's no possibility. This is a former, I guess a former student of yours, Eric Pont, said, "Hi, Prof." And I remember one time you told me you only allow yourself one weird thing per story. How many weird things did you allow yourself for the novel? Do you have?
Hi, Eric. That's such a really good question. I feel like you're allowed at least 3 in a novel. That's my arbitrary quota on it. Yeah, definitely 3.
Oh, good.
Mm-hmm.
So a friend of ours, Simon Hahn, said, "I love all the dioramas in the book and the way the structure began to resemble a diorama." And he said it was incredibly intimate and asked us to pay attention. Were dioramas always present in early drafts?
Oh, I love that question because I also love dioramas. Yeah, the dioramas were always present. I don't know how I didn't think about that when someone asked that question. Yeah, the Museum of Natural History and these sort of spaces within it were always there. I think the diorama element got stronger as it turned into a novel, which was really, really fun for me. It was a way of getting to these characters and how they thought about the past, and how they sort of put themselves in these little boxes and tried to define each other. That was really helpful for me. And also, I just think it's like when you're writing something long, or for me, I like to have something that's like not word-based that I can think about, and being able to think about those dioramas and think about those kind of imagined spaces while creating my own imagined space on the page was just, it kind of gave my brain a break in some ways, but it also the dioramas got more and more in conversation with the novel as I kept going.
And I mean, not to like derail things, but the cover is just, I can't think of a more perfect cover for the book, and how kind of wonderfully it fits in.
Yeah, I love it so much.
It's so great.
The coolest thing.
This is an interesting question. I wonder if you want to answer it. Alex has asked, have your parents read this yet? And if so, did they provide any feedback on how Ruby relates to her parents?
Yes, my parents have read this book. And my dad was really great. There were some scenes that I needed like more background information. He like took me around the building and kind of gave me a little tour, which was wonderful and really kind of him. So yeah, I think that they were really just so helpful in terms of the world building in the book, and very cool with Ruby's relationships with her parents. So I'm very grateful for that.
Another interesting question is, did any other books inspire this novel, or you? And if so, which ones?
Oh man, so many. I just reread James Baldwin's Go Tell It on a Mountain, and I'd read that like a long time ago, and I hadn't realized, I remember that the Museum of Natural History like briefly appears in it, but I hadn't realized that it also in a way is framed in a day. So I feel like that was a big influence. Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway was also like lurking in the background. I didn't read it again while I was working on this, but I remember in like reading it and being like, oh, this is like so interesting how she just moves through people's minds over the course of this day. So those are two that I think really loomed large. And also Grace Paley's short stories and just the voice of New York that sort of pops up there was also, I think it's like very different from her work in a lot of ways, but like I'm not saying it doesn't have her great voiciness, but I was really inspired by that when I was working on this.
That's great. I'm not sure how much time we have left. One question was just about, did you ever think of looking at Lily more of Lily's backstory, or how did she kind of appear in the novel and the end result?
I think there was more backstory for her at certain points that I needed to write. And then as her role as this sort of angry ghost grew, some of that felt more distracting, and it almost took away from the element that she was bringing to the novel as just this voice. It sort of felt almost dutiful, like, okay, here's her backstory, and as opposed to just the kind of weird thing that it was. But I had so much fun writing her voice that part of me wants to return to her as a character in some other place where it doesn't feel so where I can kind of give her more of the space that she deserves.
That would be awesome. And maybe one last question is just, do you have any advice for aspiring authors on embracing their weird?
Oh, yeah. I think, let's see, I don't know how good this advice is, but I think first of all, reading people like you, Kevin, like people who like bring in these weird elements so beautifully is just, for me, that is a big permission giving thing. Like sometimes things that seem too strange or absurd to be on the page, you see other people doing it so beautifully and you're like, oh, okay, this is okay. And also to remember that like you can edit anything out. You can always go back. I think that saying anything is to this or to that at an early stage stops you from seeing the shape that you're going to make on the page. And so I think just any of those to this or to that descriptors, try your best not to worry about that, or even just to lean into it. Like what happens if you are too weird, or this paragraph does go on too long. I just think giving yourself space to play in those early drafts is just really, really important. And I think you can bring those different elements together sometimes more than you think you can when you're first writing them.
I'm going to let you close it out, Lee, but I just again wanted to say just how much I have always loved your work, and how grateful I've been for your friendship, and how grateful I am that you let me be a part of this event, because I've missed you so much since you've left Nashville, and certainly during this pandemic, it's just so reassuring to have your work in the world, and it's so reassuring just to see you, to be able to just talk has been really lovely. So thank you for letting me do that.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I was saying this pandemic, very bad, but I feel so lucky that we get to have this conversation in this way, in our little diorama boxes of Zoom. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you, Kevin, and again thank the Strand for hosting this, and thank you everybody for showing up and for the great questions, and also so many thanks to Penguin Press and everybody that I've worked with there. You've all been so amazing, and I'm so grateful that you really have brought this book out and have seen it. And yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Bye.